The gunshot cracked through the storm like thunder had learned to kill, and Victor Owens knew without looking that another man had just lost his life in Ellsworth, Kansas, a town where death came cheaper than whiskey and twice as frequent. Rain hammered the dusty streets into rivers of mud as Victor led his exhausted mare toward the livery stable. His shoulders hunched against the downpour that had started 3 hours back and showed no signs of letting up. The year was 1874, and he had been riding alone for so long he sometimes forgot what his own voice sounded like. 26 years old and already worn down to the bone, Victor had spent the last 8 years drifting from town to town, taking whatever honest work he could find and moving on before anyone could ask too many questions about why a man his age had no family, no home, no ties to anything or anyone. The streets were mostly empty, sensible folk having taken shelter from the storm, but as Victor passed the narrow alley between the general store and the boarding house, he heard something that made him pull his mare to a sudden stop. Singing. A woman's voice, clear and achingly beautiful, rising above the drumming rain like a prayer offered up to an indifferent sky. He dismounted slowly, his boots squelching in the mud, and moved toward the sound. The alley was dark, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning, but in one of those brief illuminations, he saw her, standing in the rain with her face tilted upward and her arms wrapped around herself. She wore a simple calico dress that clung to her frame, soaked through, and her dark hair hung in wet ropes down her back. She could not have been more than 23 or 24 years old, and she sang like someone who had nothing left to lose. Victor stood there transfixed, rain streaming down his face, listening to a melody he did not recognize but felt in his chest like an old wound reopening. When the song ended, she lowered her head and seemed to notice him for the first time. She did not startle or cry out, just looked at him with eyes that held an ocean of sorrow. "That was beautiful," Victor said, his voice rusty from disuse. "What's it called?" "It does not have a name," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I made it up. You should not be out here in this weather. You will catch your death." She smiled then, and it was the saddest smile Victor had ever seen. "Music is all I have left," she said simply, as though that explained everything. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Victor saw the bruise on her cheek, the cut on her lip, the way she held herself as though her ribs hurt. Something fierce and protective surged up in his chest, an emotion he had not felt in years. "Who did that to you?" he asked, his voice going hard. "It does not matter anymore," she said. "He is gone." "Gone where?" "Just gone." She looked up at the sky again, letting the rain wash over her face. "I suppose I should go somewhere, find shelter, but I do not have anywhere to go." Victor made a decision in that moment that would change both their lives forever. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. "I will get you somewhere warm and dry." She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and he could see her weighing her options, calculating the risk of trusting a stranger against the certainty of staying out in the storm. Finally, she placed her small, cold hand in his. "I'm Victor," he said. "Victor Owens." "Penelope," she replied. "Penelope Wade." He led her and his mare through the muddy streets to the livery stable, where the owner, a grizzled old man named Henry, was playing cards with 2 other men by lamplight. They looked up as Victor entered, their eyes moving from him to Penelope with undisguised curiosity. "Need to board my horse," Victor said, keeping his voice neutral. "And I need to know where I can find a room for the night." Henry scratched his beard, his eyes lingering on Penelope in a way that made Victor's jaw tighten. "Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house 2 streets over," he said. "Clean rooms, decent food, does not ask too many questions." "Much obliged," Victor said, handing over coins for the horse's care. As they left the stable, Penelope stumbled, and Victor caught her elbow to steady her. She was shivering violently now, her lips tinged blue with cold. He shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders, ignoring her weak protest. "You will freeze," she said. "I have been colder," he replied, which was true enough. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but light glowed warmly in the windows, and Victor could smell something cooking inside. He knocked on the door, and after a moment it swung open to reveal a plump woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Help you?" she asked, her gaze moving between Victor and Penelope. "Need 2 rooms for the night," Victor said. "Maybe longer." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. 2 rooms. That is what I said. Something in his tone must have convinced her because she nodded and stepped aside. $2 each, paid in advance. Supper is included if you want it. Victor counted out the money and Mrs. Henderson showed them to 2 small but clean rooms on the 2nd floor, side by side. "There is hot water in the kitchen if you want to wash up," she said to Penelope, her voice softening. "And I might have a dress that would fit you if you need one." "Thank you," Penelope whispered, and Victor could hear the tears in her voice even though her eyes remained dry. After Mrs. Henderson left, Victor stood awkwardly in the hallway between their 2 rooms. "Will you be all right?" he asked. Penelope nodded, still wrapped in his coat. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You do not know anything about me." Victor thought about that for a moment. "No," he agreed, "but I know what it is like to have nothing left, and I know what it is like to be alone." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them in that dimly lit hallway, some recognition of kindred spirits. "Thank you, Victor Owens," she said softly. "Get some rest," he replied. "We can figure out everything else in the morning." But sleep did not come easy for Victor that night. He lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain drum against the roof, and thinking about the woman in the next room. He had learned long ago not to get involved in other people's troubles, had learned that attachment only led to pain, but something about Penelope Wade had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was the way she had stood in the rain singing like it was the last thing she would ever do. Maybe it was the sorrow in her eyes that mirrored his own. Or maybe he was just tired of being alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the air clean. Victor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and made his way downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson cooking breakfast in her kitchen. 3 other boarders sat at the long table, 2 cowboys and a traveling salesman, all eating in companionable silence. "Your friend still sleeping?" Mrs. Henderson asked, sliding a plate of food in front of Victor. "I suppose so," Victor replied. He had not heard any movement from Penelope's room. "She your wife?" "No, madam, just someone who needed help." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a long moment. "You are a good man, Victor Owens," she said finally. "There are not many who would do what you did last night." Victor did not know what to say to that, so he focused on his breakfast. He was halfway through his eggs when Penelope appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson must have given her. Her hair was still damp but combed, and the bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin. The conversation at the table died as the men noticed her. Victor stood quickly, pulling out the chair next to him. "Morning," he said. "Did you sleep all right?" "Better than I have in a long time," Penelope admitted, sitting down. "Thank you again for your kindness." Mrs. Henderson brought her a plate piled high with food, and Victor watched as Penelope ate with the careful deliberation of someone who had not had a proper meal in days. The other boarders eventually went back to their conversations, though Victor caught them glancing at Penelope with curiosity. After breakfast, Victor suggested they take a walk, and Penelope agreed readily. Ellsworth looked different in the morning light, the muddy streets already drying in the sun and people going about their business with the determined energy of a frontier town. They walked past the saloons and gambling halls, past the sheriff's office and the church, until they reached the edge of town where the prairie stretched out endlessly in all directions. "It is beautiful," Penelope said, shading her eyes against the sun. "It is," Victor agreed. "Though it can be lonely, too." They stood in silence for a while, and then Penelope said, "I suppose I should tell you my story. Only if you want to." She took a deep breath. "I came to Ellsworth 6 months ago with my husband, Thomas. We were married for 2 years, and for the first year it was good. But then he started drinking, and when he drank he became someone else, someone cruel." Victor felt his hands curl into fists but said nothing. "We came here because he heard there was work on the railroad. But he spent more time in the saloons than working. The money ran out and we lost our room. We had been living in a tent on the edge of town for the past month." Her voice was steady, but Victor could hear the pain beneath it. "3 days ago he came back drunk and angry, and he started hitting me. It was not the first time, but it was the worst. I fought back and he fell and hit his head on a rock. He just lay there, not moving. I tried to wake him, but I could not. I was so scared. I ran." "Did you tell anyone?" "No, I was afraid they would think I killed him. Maybe I did. I do not know if he is dead or just unconscious. I have been hiding since then, afraid to go back, afraid to stay." Victor turned to face her. "We need to find out what happened. If he is alive, we need to know. And if he is not, we need to make sure you are not blamed for defending yourself." Fear flashed in Penelope's eyes. "What if they hang me?" "They would not," Victor said with more confidence than he felt. "You were defending yourself. Any reasonable person would see that." But Ellsworth was not always a reasonable town, and Victor knew it. Still, they could not leave this hanging over Penelope's head. They walked back to town and made their way to the tent encampment on the eastern edge. It was a ramshackle collection of canvas shelters where the poorest residents lived, and Penelope led Victor to a faded tent near the back. "This was ours," she said quietly. Victor pulled back the flap and looked inside. The tent was empty except for a few scattered belongings and a dark stain on the ground that might have been blood, but there was no body. "He is gone," Penelope breathed. "But where?" They asked around the tent city carefully, and eventually found an old prospector who said he had seen a man matching Thomas's description being helped onto a wagon 2 days ago by some other workers. "Was bleeding from his head, something fierce," the prospector said, "but he was alive. Heard them say they were taking him to the doctor." Victor and Penelope went to the doctor's office, a small building near the center of town. The doctor, a tired-looking man in his 40s, confirmed that Thomas Wade had been brought to him with a head injury. "Concussion," the doctor said. "Pretty severe one. I patched him up and he left yesterday morning, said he was heading east back to Missouri." "He left?" Penelope asked, her voice faint. "That is what I said. Seemed in a hurry to get out of town, paid his bill and was gone before noon." Outside the doctor's office, Penelope leaned against the wall, her face pale. "He is alive," she said, "and he left. Without even looking for you," Victor said, anger coloring his voice. "I think he was probably ashamed, or maybe he was afraid I would press charges." She looked up at Victor. "I am free. For the first time in 2 years, I am actually free." Over the following weeks, Victor found work at a ranch just outside Ellsworth, breaking horses and mending fences. It was hard work but honest, and the foreman, a man named Jessup, paid fair wages. Victor rented a small room above the general store, and Penelope stayed on at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, working in exchange for her room and board. They fell into a routine of seeing each other most evenings, walking through town or sitting on the boarding house porch talking until the stars came out. Victor learned that Penelope had grown up in Ohio, the youngest of 5 children. Her father had been a music teacher, and he had taught all his children to sing and play instruments. Penelope's gift had been her voice, and she had dreams once of performing in concert halls. What happened to those dreams? Victor asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Life happened," Penelope said simply. "My father died when I was 17. My mother remarried a year later, and my stepfather did not approve of music, said it was frivolous. I met Thomas at a church social and he seemed kind. He said he would take me away and I could sing all I wanted. I was 19 and foolish enough to believe him." "You were not foolish," Victor said firmly. "You were hopeful. There is a difference." She smiled at him, that sad smile he was coming to know so well. "What about you, Victor Owens? What brought you to this lonely life?" So Victor told her about his own past, something he had not shared with anyone in years. He had grown up in Texas, the only son of a rancher. His parents and his younger sister had died of fever when he was 18, and he had sold the ranch rather than try to work it alone. He had been drifting ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. "Why not?" Penelope asked. "Why keep moving?" "Because if you do not put down roots, you cannot be hurt when they get torn up," Victor said. "Or at least that is what I told myself. Lately I have been thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe being alone all the time is its own kind of hurt." Penelope reached over and took his hand, and they sat like that in comfortable silence until Mrs. Henderson called them in for supper. As spring turned to summer, Victor found himself thinking about Penelope constantly. The way she hummed while she worked, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about music, the way she had slowly started to heal from the wounds her husband had left, both visible and invisible. He was falling in love with her, he realized, and the thought terrified him. One evening in late June, the town held a social at the church to raise money for a new schoolhouse. There was food and dancing, and someone had brought a fiddle. Victor worked up the courage to ask Penelope to dance, and she accepted with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. They moved across the floor together, and Victor was acutely aware of her hand in his, the way she fit perfectly in his arms. "I am not a very good dancer," he admitted. "You are doing fine," Penelope assured him. "Better than fine, actually." When the fiddle player took a break, someone called out for Penelope to sing. She looked nervous, but Victor squeezed her hand encouragingly, and she stepped up to the front of the room. She sang the same song Victor had heard that rainy night in the alley, and the room fell completely silent. Her voice soared and dipped, filling the space with such beauty that Victor felt tears prick his eyes. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before everyone erupted into applause. Penelope's cheeks were flushed as she returned to Victor's side. "That was incredible," he said. "Truly incredible. It felt good," she admitted. "I had forgotten how much I love to sing, how much I need it. Music is all you have left," Victor said, remembering her words from that first night. "Not anymore," Penelope said softly, looking up at him. "Now I have you too. If you want me to, that is." Victor's breath caught in his chest. "Penelope, I have wanted you since the moment I heard you singing in the rain, but I am just a drifter with no prospects and no future. You deserve better." "You are wrong," Penelope said firmly. "You are a good man, Victor Owens. The best man I have ever known. You saved me when you did not have to. You have been patient and kind, and you have never once tried to take advantage of me. I do not want better. I want you." Victor pulled her into his arms right there in front of everyone, not caring who saw. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. I think I have loved you since that first night." "I love you too," Penelope whispered, and then she was kissing him and nothing else mattered. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Mrs. Henderson and Jessup standing up as witnesses. Penelope wore a white dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that Victor had picked that morning. As they exchanged vows, Victor felt like he was finally coming home after years of wandering. They moved into a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. Victor continued working at the ranch, and Penelope took in sewing and gave music lessons to the children of Ellsworth. They did not have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. There were times when Penelope would wake from nightmares about Thomas, and Victor would hold her until the trembling stopped. There were times when money was tight and they went to bed with empty stomachs. But through it all, they had love and music. Penelope sang every day, filling their small house with melodies that chased away the darkness. One evening in early autumn, Penelope told Victor she was pregnant. He swept her up in his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are," Penelope confirmed, her eyes shining with joy. "Are you happy?" "I have never been happier in my entire life," Victor said honestly. The pregnancy was not easy. Penelope was sick for the first few months and Victor worried constantly. But Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a mother to both of them, helped with advice and remedies. Slowly Penelope's health improved, and by winter her belly was round and she glowed with happiness. Victor spent those months preparing for the baby, building a cradle from wood and carving toys in the evenings. He worked extra hours at the ranch, saving every penny he could. Jessup, who had become a good friend, gave him a raise and promised that the job would be waiting for him after the baby was born. On a cold February morning in 1876, their son came into the world with a loud cry that announced his displeasure at the cold air. Victor held his boy for the first time with shaking hands, marveling at the tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair. They named him Daniel after Penelope's father. "He is perfect," Victor whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He is ours," Penelope said, exhausted but radiant. "We made something beautiful, Victor." The early months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Daniel was a fussy baby who did not sleep well, and there were many nights when Victor and Penelope took turns walking the floor with him. But there were also moments of perfect joy, like when Daniel smiled for the first time, or when he calmed immediately at the sound of Penelope singing. As Daniel grew, Victor watched in amazement as he developed his own personality. He had Penelope's dark eyes and Victor's stubborn chin, and he was curious about everything. Victor taught him to ride as soon as he was old enough to sit on a horse, and Penelope sang to him every night before bed. When Daniel was 3, Penelope became pregnant again. This time it was an easier pregnancy, and in the spring of 1879 they welcomed a daughter they named Sarah. She was the opposite of Daniel, a calm and content baby who slept through the night almost from the start. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Victor continued working at the ranch, and eventually Jessup made him foreman when he retired. It came with a better salary and more responsibility, and Victor threw himself into the work with dedication. Penelope's music lessons had become popular, and she had a steady stream of students. She also sang at church every Sunday, her voice as beautiful as ever. The years passed quickly, marked by birthdays and holidays and the everyday moments that made up a life. Daniel grew tall and serious, with a gift for working with horses. Sarah was quieter but had inherited her mother's musical talent, and by the time she was 5 she could carry a tune better than most adults. One evening when Daniel was 8 and Sarah was 5, they all sat on the porch watching the sunset, something that had become a family tradition. Daniel was practicing his roping technique, and Sarah was singing a song Penelope had taught her. "Do you ever miss it?" Victor asked Penelope quietly. "The traveling, the chance to sing in bigger places." Penelope looked at him with surprise. "Miss it? Victor, I have everything I ever wanted right here. You, our children, our home. This is what I dreamed of when I was standing in that alley singing in the rain. I just did not know it yet." "I still remember that night," Victor said. "You looked so lost, so alone, I almost kept walking." "Thank God you did not," Penelope said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You saved my life that night." "We saved each other," Victor corrected. "I was just as lost as you were. I had just given up on ever finding a home." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play, and Victor felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. This was what life was supposed to be, he thought. Not the loneliness and drifting of his youth, but this, a family, a purpose, love. In 1882, when Daniel was 10 and Sarah was 7, Ellsworth faced one of the worst droughts in years. The prairie turned brown and brittle, and the ranch where Victor worked lost a third of its cattle. Money became tight for everyone in town, and there were nights when Victor and Penelope went without so their children could eat. But the community pulled together in ways that reminded Victor why he had stopped drifting. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing what little they had. The church organized meals for the families hit hardest, and Penelope volunteered to help cook and serve. Through it all, she sang, lifting spirits with her music when food and water were scarce. The drought finally broke in early autumn with rains that lasted for 3 days. The prairie slowly came back to life, and with it, the town's fortunes improved. The ranch hired more workers and Victor's workload increased, but so did his pay. That winter, Mrs. Henderson fell ill. She was nearly 70 now, and the illness hit her hard. Penelope spent long hours at her bedside, caring for the woman who had shown her such kindness years ago. Victor came by whenever he could, bringing firewood and supplies. One evening, sitting by Mrs. Henderson's bed, the old woman took Penelope's hand. "You have become like a daughter to me," she said, her voice weak. "I want you to know that watching you and Victor build your life together has been one of my greatest joys." "Please do not talk like that," Penelope said, tears streaming down her face. "You are going to get better." But Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "We both know that is not true, but I am not afraid. I have lived a good life and I am ready." She looked at Victor, who stood in the doorway. "Take care of each other. That is all that matters in the end. Love and family." Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully that night, and the whole town mourned her loss. At her funeral, Penelope sang a hymn that left not a dry eye in the church. Afterward, they discovered that Mrs. Henderson had left her boarding house to Penelope and Victor in her will. "She wanted you to have a stable future," the lawyer explained, "and she knew you would take good care of the place." It was overwhelming and humbling. They already had their small house, but the boarding house represented real financial security. After much discussion, they decided that Penelope would manage the boarding house while Victor continued at the ranch. It meant busier lives, but it also meant they could start saving for their children's future. The years continued to roll forward. Daniel became a skilled horseman and started working at the ranch alongside his father when he turned 14. Sarah's musical talent blossomed, and she began performing with her mother at various town events. They were a team, the 4 of them, working together to build something lasting. In 1887, when Victor was 39 and Penelope was 36, they took a trip back to where it all began, standing in the alley where they first met. It was a warm evening, nothing like that rainy night 13 years ago, but the memory was as vivid as ever. "I was so scared that night," Penelope admitted. "I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left." "Music is all I have left," Victor quoted softly. "That is what you said. I was wrong, though. I had more than music. I just needed someone to help me see it." She turned to face him. "You gave me everything, Victor. A home, children, a life worth living. How can I ever thank you for that?" "You already have," Victor said, pulling her close. "Every single day we have together is thanks enough." They kissed there in that alley. No longer the broken, lonely people they had been, but something stronger, something forged through years of love and struggle and triumph. As they walked home hand in hand, Penelope began to sing the song from that rainy night, the one she had made up when she thought music was all she had left. But now the melody sounded different, Victor realized. It was no longer sad, but hopeful. It was no longer about loss, but about finding something precious when you least expected it. Back at their house, Daniel and Sarah were waiting on the porch. Daniel was now 17, a tall young man who looked so much like Victor it was startling. Sarah was 14, beautiful and talented, with her mother's voice and her father's determination. "We were wondering when you two would get back," Daniel said with a grin. "Mother, Mr. Jameson from the church stopped by. He wants to know if you and Sarah will sing at the Harvest Festival next month." "Of course we will," Penelope said, her eyes shining. "We would be honored." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Victor and Penelope sat on their porch looking at the stars. It was something they had done countless times over the years, but it never got old. The prairie stretched out before them, dark and mysterious, full of possibilities. "You ever think about what would have happened if we had never met?" Penelope asked. "If you had just kept riding that night?" Victor thought about it. "I would probably still be drifting," he said. "Still alone, still running from anything that felt like it might matter. I would have missed out on everything that makes life worth living." "I would probably be dead," Penelope said bluntly. "Or worse." "I had given up, Victor. I was singing in that rain because I thought it would be the last thing I ever did. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even known I was praying." "I love you," Victor said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he said them. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Penelope replied, "my lonely cowboy who found me in the rain." The Harvest Festival was a grand affair, with people coming from neighboring towns to celebrate the successful growing season. There were games and food and music, and the whole town seemed to be in high spirits. When Penelope and Sarah took the stage to sing, the crowd fell silent in anticipation. They performed several songs together, their voices blending in perfect harmony. But it was the final song, the one Penelope had sung that rainy night so many years ago, that brought down the house. She had added verses over the years, turning it from a song of loss into a song of hope and redemption. Sarah joined in on the chorus, and by the end, many in the audience were wiping away tears. After they finished, a man in an expensive suit approached them. He introduced himself as Theodore Marsh, a theatrical agent from Kansas City. "That was extraordinary," he said. "I would like to offer you both the opportunity to perform in Kansas City. We could make you famous." Penelope looked at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with excitement, and then at Victor, who stood nearby with Daniel. She saw her whole life reflected in their faces, everything she had built, everything that mattered. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh," Penelope said politely, "but we are not interested. Our place is here with our family." Sarah looked disappointed for a moment, but then she nodded. "Mother is right," she said. "This is where we belong." After Mr. Marsh left, looking baffled, Victor came over and hugged Penelope. "You could have gone," he said. "You could have had everything you once dreamed of." "I already have everything I ever dreamed of," Penelope said firmly. Right here. Time continued its relentless march. Daniel fell in love with a girl named Emma from a neighboring ranch, and they were married when he was 20. It was a joyful celebration, and watching his son start his own family filled Victor with a profound sense of continuity. He was no longer just building a life for himself, but creating a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. Sarah, meanwhile, decided she wanted to be a music teacher like her grandfather had been. She studied diligently with her mother and began taking on her own students when she turned 18. She had suitors, plenty of them, but she was in no hurry to marry, content with her music and her family. When Daniel and Emma announced they were expecting a baby, Victor felt the weight of becoming a grandfather with joy and a touch of melancholy. Where had the time gone? It seemed like just yesterday he had been holding Daniel as a newborn, and now Daniel was about to have a child of his own. The baby, a boy they named Victor after his grandfather, arrived in the spring of 1892. Holding his grandson for the first time, Victor understood in a new way what it meant to have roots, to have family that extended beyond yourself. This child carried his name into the future, a future Victor had once thought he would face alone. "He looks like you," Penelope said, standing beside Victor as they admired their grandson. "He looks like all of us," Victor replied. "He is the future." Life in Ellsworth continued to evolve. The wild frontier days were largely behind them now, replaced by a more settled, civilized existence. The railroad had brought prosperity and growth, and the town had expanded considerably from the rough frontier settlement it had been when Victor first arrived. But some things never changed. Victor still worked with horses, though now he owned his own small stable rather than working for someone else. Penelope still sang, her voice as beautiful in her 50s as it had been in her 20s. They still sat on their porch every evening watching the sunset. And they still loved each other with the intensity of that first meeting in the rain. In 1895, Sarah announced she was engaged to a schoolteacher named Robert, who had moved to Ellsworth from Illinois. He was a kind, thoughtful man who loved music as much as Sarah did, and Victor gave his blessing gladly. Their wedding was another joyful celebration, with Penelope and Sarah singing a duet that had everyone reaching for their handkerchiefs. Daniel and Emma had 2 more children, daughters they named Mary and Elizabeth, and Victor and Penelope's house was often full of the sound of grandchildren playing. Victor taught young Victor to ride, just as he had taught Daniel, and the circle continued. One evening in late summer of 1898, Victor and Penelope took a walk through town, something they still did regularly. Ellsworth had changed so much over the years, but the bones of it remained the same. They passed the church where they had married, the boarding house that Mrs. Henderson had left them, the alley where they first met. "We have lived a good life," Victor said, "better than I ever thought possible." "We have," Penelope agreed, "and it is not over yet. We still have years ahead of us." And they did. Years of watching their grandchildren grow, of celebrating holidays and birthdays, of dealing with the everyday challenges and joys that made up a life. There were hard times, too. The winter of 1900 was brutal, and they lost several friends to illness. But they weathered each storm together, their love a constant anchor in an ever-changing world. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1905, their children and grandchildren threw them a surprise party. The whole town seemed to be there, a testament to the life they had built and the people they had touched. There were speeches and toasts, and when Penelope sang, her voice still clear and strong, Victor felt his heart swell with pride and love. 30 years, Penelope said later that night as they prepared for bed. "Can you believe it has been 30 years? Sometimes it feels like yesterday, Victor said, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I would not change a single moment, Penelope said, not even the hard ones. They all led us here to this life we have built. Victor pulled her close, marveling at how she still fit perfectly in his arms after all these years. Music is all I have left, he murmured, repeating the words that had changed both their lives. That is what you said that night. I was wrong, Penelope said softly. I had music, yes. But I also had hope, even if I did not know it. I had the possibility of love, of a future. And then you came along and turned that possibility into reality. We were both lost, Victor said, both lonely, but we found each other. And made a family, Penelope added, and a home. And a life worth singing about. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children and grandchildren. Young Victor grew into a fine young man who inherited his grandfather's way with horses. Mary showed signs of musical talent that made Penelope beam with pride. Elizabeth was quiet and studious, always reading. Daniel and Emma's family grew stable and strong, and Sarah and Robert welcomed their first child, a son named Daniel after his uncle. Victor and Penelope grew older, their hair turning gray and then white, their steps slower but their love unwavering. They had been together for nearly 4 decades, and every morning Victor woke grateful for another day with the woman who had saved him just as surely as he had saved her. On a warm evening in July of 1912, Victor and Penelope sat on their porch watching yet another sunset. It had been 38 years since that rainy night in the alley, and they were both 74 years old now. Their children were grown with families of their own, and their grandchildren were starting to have children, making Victor and Penelope great-grandparents. You remember what Mrs. Henderson said before she died? Penelope asked. About love and family being all that matters. I do, Victor said. She was right. We have been so blessed, Penelope said, to have found each other, to have built this life. Not everyone gets this kind of happiness. No, Victor agreed. They do not. Penelope began to sing then softly the song from that rainy night so long ago. But it was no longer a song of despair. Over the years it had transformed into something else entirely, a song of hope and love, and the unexpected ways life could surprise you. Victor listened, as he had listened hundreds of times before, never tiring of the beauty of her voice or the truth in her words. When she finished, she took his hand, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the laughter of their great-grandchildren playing, and closer, the sound of Daniel and Sarah talking with their spouses. We did well, Victor said finally. We took 2 broken lives and made something whole. We did more than that, Penelope corrected. We created a legacy. Our love, our family, it will continue long after we are gone. And it would, Victor knew. They had built something that would endure, roots sunk deep into this prairie soil. He was no longer the lonely cowboy drifting from town to town, and Penelope was no longer the woman standing alone in the rain with only her music. They had become something greater together, something that would live on in their children and their children's children. As the night deepened and the air cooled, they went inside, Victor's arm around Penelope's waist, her head resting on his shoulder. They moved slowly these days, but they moved together as they always had. In bed that night, Victor held Penelope close, listening to her steady breathing as she drifted off to sleep. He thought about all the nights they had lain like this, thousands of them now, each one precious, each one a gift. He thought about that rainy night when he could have kept riding, could have ignored the sound of singing in an alley. What a different life he would have had, how much emptier and colder. Thank you, he whispered to Penelope, though she was already asleep. Thank you for standing in that rain. Thank you for your courage and your strength and your love. Thank you for making my life worth living." The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Victor woke to find Penelope already up, humming in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. The smell of coffee filled the house, and through the window, Victor could see Daniel arriving with young Victor, who was now a man of 20 with his own dreams and ambitions. This was his life, Victor thought with deep satisfaction. This was what he had been searching for during all those lonely years of drifting, though he had not known it. Not excitement or adventure or fortune, but simply this: a home, a family, someone to love and be loved by in return. After breakfast, Sarah arrived with her children, and soon the house was full of family. They talked and laughed, sharing stories and making plans for the upcoming harvest. Penelope sang for them, as she so often did, and Victor watched his family's faces light up at the sound of her voice, just as his own had that rainy night so long ago. Later that afternoon, Victor and Penelope walked down to the alley where they had met, something they did on special occasions. It looked different now, paved and clean with proper buildings on either side, but the memory remained vivid. "I think about that night often," Penelope said. "How close I came to giving up completely, and then there you were, a stranger who became my savior." "You saved me too," Victor reminded her. "I was existing, not living. You taught me the difference." They stood in silence for a moment, remembering, and then Penelope began to sing. Her voice was not as strong as it once had been, the years having taken their toll, but it was still beautiful, still capable of stirring deep emotions. And as Victor listened to her sing that familiar song about loss and hope and love, he felt tears stream down his weathered cheeks. A small crowd gathered, people stopping to listen to the old woman singing in the alley. They did not know the history of this place, did not know that they were witnessing something sacred. But they felt it anyway, the power of the music, the love behind the words. When Penelope finished, the crowd applauded and she smiled, that same smile Victor had fallen in love with decades ago. "Music is all I have left," someone in the crowd called out, repeating the famous line from her song. "Not anymore," Penelope called back. "Now I have everything." They walked home hand in hand, these two old people who had found each other in the rain and built a life together against all odds. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, and Victor thought about how many sunsets they had watched together, how many more they might have. However many it would not be enough. A lifetime with Penelope would never be enough. But he was grateful for every moment, every day, every year they had been given. That evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Victor and Penelope held court like the royalty they were, at least in this small corner of the world. They told stories of the old days, when Ellsworth was young and wild and full of danger. They talked about the people they had known, the changes they had witnessed, the life they had built together. And when it grew late and everyone began to head home, Victor and Penelope found themselves alone again on their porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Kansas sky. "I love you, Victor Owens," Penelope said. "I have loved you for 38 years, and I will love you for whatever time we have left." "And I love you, Penelope Owens," Victor replied. "My songbird, my salvation, my home." They sat together in the peaceful night, two hearts beating as one, two lives so completely intertwined that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. They had been lonely once, both of them, lost souls wandering in the dark. But they had found each other in the rain and built something beautiful from their brokenness. And that, Victor thought as Penelope began to hum softly beside him, was all anyone could ever ask for. A chance meeting that became a lifetime of love. A moment of courage that changed everything. a song in the rain that led to a symphony of happiness. As the night deepened and the world grew quiet around them, Victor and Penelope remained on their porch, reluctant to let the day end. These were the moments they treasured most now, the quiet times when it was just the two of them, as it had been in the beginning. "Sing for me one more time," Victor requested softly. And Penelope did, her voice carrying across the prairie, a sound of such beauty and love that it seemed to make the stars shine brighter. She sang of loneliness and hope, of despair and salvation, of two people who found each other when they needed it most. It was the song of their life together, and it was far from over. There were still mornings to wake up in each other's arms, still sunsets to watch from this porch, still grandchildren to teach and love to share. The lonely cowboy and the woman singing in the rain had found something precious, something eternal. They had found home in each other's hearts, and that was a song that would never end.